Well, thank you very much for welcoming me to your historical society, and I'm here because I think Jack got me here, and I'm not sure what my agenda really is, but I'll speak as I just think and on the feet and speak to you about the fact that I come from this area. I was born and reared in Ottawa Street in a 2-up, 2-down house. My grandmother lived in number 64, and my parents lived with my grandmother and my grandfather for a short time. And then we lived in number 13 Ottawa Street. If any of you know the street, it had 2 narrow windows. And then when I was 9-year-old, we left there and we got a council house, or a housing executive house it was now, in Silverstream. And moving from Ottawa Street to Silverstream was quite a wonderful experience because we had a bathroom, and we were up there at the edge of the mountain, and it was a very pleasant place to work and live for a number of years. When I passed, interesting, the Shankill graveyard has also already been mentioned this morning, and what my thoughts about the Shankill graveyard is simply this, that my mother, who was called Peggy, was a twin, and her brother George, when he was delivered in the house in number 64 Ottawa Street, he died. And my grandmother's story was, as was my grandfather, that my grandfather put the little child in a small cardboard box and took him to the Shankill graveyard, paid the man a few shillings, as it were, and he buried the child. So when I pass the Shankill graveyard, I have an attachment with it, but I have no idea whatsoever what the circumstances are regarding any memorial to the child. I don't even know whether the child was registered as born, no idea, but it was a full-born baby. And what I did find was that this is why I took an interest in this, because across the street is the funeral director, Sandy Close, and I discovered that Agnes Close had actually taken on a campaign. Sandy and Agnes lost their son, Maxwell, and he was stillborn. And what she was concerned about was that people who lost their children at childbirth, up until really into the 1970s, were just told by the hospital, we look after this, and the children were buried on a plot at the city cemetery. Now it's most interesting because Agnes started a campaign and she found 7,160 babies born in that plot, which enabled her to have them all marked, and there's a beautiful stone in the city cemetery now to the memory of those children. And I was privileged back last year to dedicate the stone and be there with people from both communities in Northern Ireland. When I went to school, I went to Mayo Street School until I moved up to Ballysill and Ligandeal. People call that part of the world Turner Road. And my background was interesting because I went to St Mark's School on Ligandeal Road, which was a church school. My father wasn't particularly of mind that the education there was great, so eventually I moved to Everton. And I remember seeing the last boy of the school leaving school at 14. I then had to go to school until I was 15. But alas, I failed the 11 plus, and I ended up in what became morphed into what was Everton Secondary School. To say the least, I didn't like school. I didn't particularly like it because I could see no end goal. And being a young fella with other young fellas, we played it up to the teachers. And especially the men teachers were extremely liberal with the cane. And I would reckon at times I got caned just about every day. I remember on one occasion a teacher who was as broad as he was long, as we would say, and was a rugby player. And we were out in the fields, and he was a very rough character. And he thumped a boy, a smaller boy than me. He thumped a boy, and the boy fell to the ground crying. Well, with another lad, we thought this was completely unreasonable. So we took the teacher by the scruff of the neck, and he ended up on the railings of Everton playing fields. And we told him, we'll thump you. If you do that again, we'll really thump you. And he went white. And we thought, we're going to be expelled from school. This is going to be a problem. But nothing ever happened. And my reckoning was that he was afraid to take it any further. However, my experience was going to a cricket match one day in probably in the 1980s, and seeing a man walking around the ground. I said to my friend, "Do you know that man there?" "Ah, yes," he said. "He was a PE teacher in one of the schools down here." And I thought, that's him. So as he walked around the boundary, I stopped him and said hello to him. I said, "I think I was at school in your time. What's your name?" I gave him a name. He simply said, "Oh, I know who you are." And he walked on. I think my memories of living in this part of the area was living here after the war. There were air raid shelters at the end of Ottawa Street, and we used to play in the air raid shelters. There was also a lot of, really some degree, after the war was a difficult period altogether. There was rationing. Some of that you will all remember. And my interesting background was that my grandfather was from Ballymena. Now, I always supported the Labour Party, which wouldn't have been he would have been in a minority, but he always supported the Labour Party. And he always advocated for non-sectarian politics in Northern Ireland. And he was very well read. He knew a lot about the history of the Northern Ireland Labour Party. But anyhow, what happened was, I tried to find something out about him. And I discovered, looking at the 1911 census, the Irish census, that he's one of 10 children born in Ballymena who are all, and Jack will be delighted to hear, are all Presbyterian. But they can't spell it. So the Y becomes an I. And the person at the top of the family is obviously my grandfather's grandfather. And he's 70 years of age, and he's called John McCuckman. And he's an RC against the name. I don't know whether that was part of my experience or not, but or whether that tipped his perhaps more liberal political views. When I came here as a boy, there was lots of mission halls around, of course. There was the Welcome Mission Hall. My grandmother became a Christian through the Welcome Mission Hall. There was Disarella Street, which is not really Disarella Street, but it's always called that. And sad to see that the mission hall there lies in ruins. They're trying obviously to sell it. There are other things as well. I mean, church going was interesting because my grandfather was a Presbyterian, and he attended one of two churches during my lifetime. One was as a boy, nowhere else but Townsend Street. And he told me this, that if you didn't get to Townsend Street Church by 6:30 on a Sunday night, you might have difficulty getting a seat. I don't know many of your church hold, but I think it's 1,500, Jack, or thereabouts.
By that.
He was very impressed by a Presbyterian minister who he told me was originally a Methodist called Whipras. And then he told me about another man who came called Johnson. And he went there on a Sunday night. Why did he not go to Sunday morning? Well, he worked the shipyard. And he probably found at the end of the week he was tired. And so church going wasn't really so much a thing for morning people. And the morning services were smaller. People went to an evening service. And that's where my grandfather went. Or initially then, after some years, he went to Agnes Street Presbyterian, where Donald Gillies was the minister. And I recall Donald Gillies with some affection. Now, my grandmother had a brother. Could anybody get me a drink of water somewhere? Yeah. Change that. I'll stop. Any questions so far? So anyway, my grandfather had a brother, or my grandmother had a brother called Harry. And Harry was on the British Army, and he served in the First World War. So he was always very proud of his army background. But his wife died at his wife died at childbirth, and she left 3 children. So Uncle Harry, he remarried Teresa, Roman Catholic. Now my grandmother always liked Teresa because she had 3 further children. And the 3 further children, now here's the lady to rescue me.
No,
It's not.
she's just got hers.
No, you're fine. She had 3 further children. And so my grandmother's attitude to her was very positive. And every Monday, Auntie Teresa came up to help my granny do the washing. But I had a tin flute. And of course, the tunes of the area, you don't have to be told what they are. And I learned to play them always on the tin flute. But my granny recalls saying to me, you see, on Monday when your Aunt Teresa is here, that tin flute won't be here. It was probably a kind of respect thing that she would have held on to. So I was born in 1945, just at the end, just before, well, D-Day really. And as I say, life was pretty difficult. The world that some of us have lived in, and Jim would be one, I know Jim well, the world that we live in really has changed from beyond recognition. I remember working for a while for the Grosvenor Hall, and I was visiting on the Grosvenor Road, and went into this wee house, and the couple told me they had a son in New Zealand. And they said to me, I said to see, oh, we write a letter, we write letters. He writes to us, we write to him. But we speak to him once a year. And I said, well, how do you speak to him once a year? Thank you, sir, you're a gentleman. How do you speak to him? Oh, you do the pouring for me, make the vodka, you see. So,
Jim Jack to put the vodka in, Jim.
no.
That's good, that goes all work.
Brilliant. Where was it?
New Zealand.
New Zealand. So, I said to the lady, you speak to, well, she said on Christmas Eve, at a certain time, he rings the corner shop, and he leaves the phone down. And then they come up and say, come down to the shop, he's going to ring in 10 minutes. What a world, what a difference. I mean, if you have a WhatsApp on your phone, you can ring New Zealand for free, any day of the week, as long as you make sure you've got the time right. That was my background, really, and I go on to say that I was brought up in a pretty religious background. When we moved to Linganeel, my father worked in Yurt's Mill, and the church to go to was Ballysillan Presbyterian Church. But the truth is that my father wouldn't go there. And the reason for not going there was that all the managers of yurts went there. And he didn't want to sit amongst his, managers. And so he ended up going to Belfast City Mission, which eventually located at Wilson Road. But in the days when I went to Sunday school, up the hill, facing St. Vincent de Paul's Catholic Church. These are all my memories of the past. But when I was about 14, I went to the Elam Pentecostal Church, where my father used to go in the evening. And I got converted, became a Christian really. And I was there for a while. And while I was there, certain things happened. The youth leader was stood down for some unknown reason. And some of the young people left, and I was one of them. And so one day, a friend of mine, a second cousin, invited me to Shankill Methodist Church. And essentially that's how I'm in the Methodist ministry. He invited me to church. He said to me, I'll stand outside and be there for you and bring you in. I think that's a very important thing when you're going into a place that you don't know anything about. And then the influence on my life was a very famous Methodist minister called Sidney Callahan. Now he lived in Agnes Street at 168 Agnes Street. And he had a famous neighbour called Ginny Tweedy. She was a character. Sidney was single at the time, he was unmarried. And he lived in the community, and his life was just, his house was open. Everybody was coming in and out that house. And he did remarkable work in the area. I think he inspired me to consider going into the ministry, which never ever, because my mother said the following, Jack, don't take offence. Mother told me, she says, you know, ministers are the sons of wealthy people who they wanted to become a doctor, but they failed, and so they became a minister. And of many, many things I can share with you in my life that are somewhat. How long do we go for? What? Half an hour or what?
You're okay, you're okay, go half an hour, you're right.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, my grandmother had a cousin, and her son, who was the nephew. After World War II, in the early 50s, he came from Scotland to live with my granny. He came from where I believe Robbie Burns' his grave is, Dumfries.
That's correct.
So he was something of a character, and he thought he could fix everything. He was trying to get work in Northern Ireland. For some reason he took a notion. He'd been on the Navy. And the way he talked to us was to the effect that you would have considered that he was a personal friend of Lord Louis Mountbatten. For he was on the ship with Mountbatten. He gave us the impression he nearly dined with him, but we didn't believe a word of it. Anyway, the one thing he taught me to do was to clean my shoes. Military background. And I showed me spit and polish and various tricks to clean your shoes. And I cleaned my shoes. And I have a sort of OCD about it. I don't go out of the house without cleaning my shoes. So anyway, one day I was going to study at a college in Oxford, and I got a bus with another friend who was very spick and span, and we went out this road in a bus, and we didn't know where we were. So it was a bit like going up the Springfield Road instead of going up the Cronin Road. So we stopped at a house to see if we could get directions. So this lady came out, little lady, very, very army-like, you know. And she said, no, you have to go through that long part. Like 20 minutes walk there, but you might be better getting a bus into the city and coming back out. And then she said, no, I'll take you. So she had a BMW. And we got into this BMW, and this 80-plus-year-old drove us to the college. I said to her, in passing, thank you very much for bringing us, as 2 Irishmen, I said, 2 Irishmen. You don't know anything about them, and you're prepared to take the risk and bring them round to this college. She looked at me and she said, well, I looked at your shoes, and men who clean their shoes are not rogues. And it's some quite interesting experiences in life, because I'm very much a home in touch with what you'd call the working class roots. I've lived through all of that myself. And when the Troubles came, I was working in the East Belfast Mission at the time. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. When I was left school, I got a job in Munster Sims, which was a hardware business. And my job was to take a small bogie, go up 3 stories, get stuff from the department. It might be delf, might be ornaments, might be pots and pans. And these were all put into the bogie, and I was downstairs to the dispatch. They packed it and went out in a van. Now, when I went there at first, there were a few wee boys he started, and this man called Ken Boyce, very well dressed, managing director, he said to us, now, you know, you boys, remember, he says, this is where I started, in this company. And he said, there's no reason that any one of you cannot be in my seat someday. So one day I was up on this floor, you know, and this man, Joss Waters, who had the typical hairstyle of the time, you know, soap and water, middle shade. And he says to me, son, did Ken Boyce tell you that someday you could be the managing director of Munster Sims? Oh, I said, he does. He tells all the wee boys that. He says, let me tell you, son, you are pushing a boogie at the moment. You're called in this company a boogie boy. And when you get older, you'll simply be a boogie man. So that was my experience I studied hard to enter the ministry, truthfully. Night work, studying. I went into the Methodist ministry in 1967. I was in college for 3 years. I was a probationer. I worked on the Craiger Road at Craiger Methodist. We had 500 of a congregation on a Sunday morning. And the minister was called Dr. Hedley Washington Plunkett, quite a big name in the Methodist Church at the time. And then, of course, I left there and I went to work in Fermanagh, in Urbanstown. And that was quite a shock. You know, I didn't know anything about silage. And, you know, I didn't realise that asking a farmer how many cows he had was a wee bit politically incorrect, because you were asking a farmer to tell you, or another man would ask another man, how much money have you got in the bank? So I learned about living in the country and living in a rural area where people were reserved, didn't always give you their opinions, but were very, very kind to you. And I was there for 6 years, and then I went to work in East Belfast. And I was there from 1978 to 1999, a period of 21 years. And during that time, it became a Methodist mission. And it came from nothing to something. When I would be at church on Sunday morning, this man would come out, shake my hand, and speak to me very warmly. And one day, I received a phone call from his wife. she said to me, Tommy is in hospital. It was Sunday, we'll not be at church today. Tommy's in hospital. Well, Tommy, like myself, he carried a bit of a belly. So I thought he's a heart attack, something like that. But then she said, no, he's in the Graham Clinic. He's in Knockbracken. He's an alcoholic. I said, didn't know that. No, she said, you wouldn't know that. Well, he's an alcoholic. And so when I went out to see him that Sunday evening, May 1980, still remember it, this man was being dried out in the alcoholic unit. And he talked to me for a while and told me about his background. He told me that the paramilitaries had burned him out of his business. He had a wood business, a DIY shop, and they burned him out because he wouldn't pay protection money. But it was a remarkable story, for what happened was this: he told me that he really wanted to get his life back in order, and we prayed together, and I believe he gave his life to the Lord, and in an amazing way, he never drank again. He died from asbestosis, sadly, eventually. But one day he said to me, he said, you know, I'm a caterer, that's my profession, that's what I do. He said, open the church hall, let me come in, and I'll make food, and people can come in. Sounds very basic. So 3 potatoes, some peas, and 2 sausages, 50p. That was the way it went. And it would never ever pass health and safety, I can assure you that, in today's world. But people came in from all over the place. So real that we were finding a situation whereby some of these people are homeless. So they're going out of here to go, not know where they're going. And so eventually we built a hostel called Hosford House. The whole thing took off. One day a guy arrived in my office and he said to me, I'm the PA for Prince Charles. He said, would you open a homework centre? Well, I thought, well, I don't know. Well, he said, think about it. And when I came out to church that night, I saw this building across the road, and I said, there's a building we need for the homework centre. I got the money, £27,000, bought it, and opened a homework centre. Now, this is what Jack will know, but nobody else in the room probably knows it. Jason Nicholson, who is in a senior position in the administration of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, regarded with the Children's Fund, was one of our lads in the homework centre. We were concerned about how do kids do their homework, what space do they get, what's a family like, and we discovered that this took off tremendously. Kids came in about 4 o'clock, give them a drink of orange juice, we could have a break and play a game of pool or table tennis, and then and teachers would come in and give their time. Former teachers, people who were ex-teachers or retired. A bit like Equipping for Life, really, in some ways. But it was a really, really great success. There was some very difficult moments around killings. And I remember the day I met the UDA. And that was Andy Terry, John McMichael. And it began to create places where I would try to have conversations with paramilitary organisations. And that became another factor around the Shankill as well, with people like Jim McDonald, David Irvine, others, to try and have a conversation with them. Now, one day I visited a home in South Belfast, and the lady had a friend in the home. And the woman introduced me as Pearl McKeown. September 1984 was a terrible, terrible year in the Troubles. And there was a young fella, and he was a one-parent family. What had happened was his mother, who was about 35, decided to marry a man who was 65. Neither were ever married, but they had a son. She had a son from another relationship. So the old man really was there to be kind of a carer to the son. And then what happened was the mother died, largely due to, well, the situation regarding I say no more. But then in 1984, in September, Billy Nixon was making his way from pub at the end of Templemore Avenue when he was shot dead. Totally sectarian murder. A young fella in his early teens was left without a carer, eventually taken on board by his family. But on the same night, and it'll probably be my memory to some of you, where the Albert Bridge Congregational Church is, they fired on a group of young people and they killed Karen McKeown. Karen McKeown was a GB leader. Karen McKeown lived for 3 weeks and then she died. And the woman in the room with me was Pearl McKeown. She then told me something that I found quite striking. She said, I went and I met Jerry Adams in the Sinn Féin building on the Falls. And she said, I gave him Karen's Bible. Do you know, I was a bit uncomfortable about that. Not sure how I reacted. But then one day, some years later, in the early 90s, I received a phone call from Sam Birch, who was a Methodist minister. And he asked me would I meet representatives of the Provisional IRA in Clogher. I knew my head would be on the block with many people in East Belfast, but I decided to do it. And I went into the room, and there was Jerry Adams. Now, at that particular point, 1984, his voice was being dubbed over by an actor because they weren't allowed to give interviews, but they got round it. So, just introducing myself to him, I says, I know a woman who knows you, Pearl McKeown. Yeah, he says, I do know that. He said, she gave me Karen's Bible. And he said, you won't believe this, but I do read it. Now, I make no judgment on that. But there is a verse in the Bible which says the following. The Word of God is living, active, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing the division of the soul and spirits, of joints and marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of men. So I leave that one with you. Some of my stories are interesting. There's a story in this book. These books are, let me just say this to you. If you want one of these books, they're actually $12.95, but I'm selling them for £5. And if you want a book and you don't have the money, don't worry about it. Give it to somebody and get it. I get it again. Well, this book is virtually sold out, so I have really no spare copies. But what I have is this here for Susan. And I wrote this book and Susan never turned up. So if you know a Susan anywhere, give her this book with my best book. Leave a book for me, I'm Susan. No Susan. I went to work, I mean, when I was a young minister, there was an old guy, Ted Edwards. He was from the north of England. He was a minister in Northern Ireland. Great character. And so he was taking part in a service on Radio Ulster, morning service, at the Newton Abbey Mission with Billy Buchanan, the minister. And he said a prayer. And in the prayer, he prayed for the safe release of Terry Waite. Now, what's the story? Terry Waite heard it. Imprisoned in Beirut, lying in a room with a radio put together with sellotape. He heard it. And he said, bless you, old man, wherever you are, bless you. He said, shut up in bed. And the nice thing was that when he returned from being in prison in Beirut, Kelbase captors, he came back to Bell, England, and he got in contact with Ted. And if you read Terry Waite's autobiography, the story is in the autobiography. I reckon that I've had a very good life. In 2003, I was the president of the Methodist Church and I had a heart attack. And that really set me back. Mother had died from a heart attack. Granny had died from a heart attack in the family. But eventually I got 8 stents in. And that to sum together is why I'm here. And then one day I was doing a funeral, 2006, from Shankill Methodist, and in doing the funeral I suddenly found I was slurring words. I didn't know what happened. And the next day I went to Craigavon Hospital to be checked for a stroke. But I actually didn't have a stroke. They didn't know what I had. I hadn't a clue. It took 6 months for them to diagnose me with a thing called myasthenia gravis. And I ended up in the ICU, the Royal, thought I was going to die. But I was given a drug that was a high-risk drug that could have killed me, but I took it. And the result has been that I'm here today, and in a few months I'll be 78.
Well done.
So I still do what I can do. I do it for the Lord's work. As for the books, well, they're all stories, short stories. People like them. This book here was the largest selling Christian book in Northern Ireland. So this was the second book which I had to write during COVID. Didn't get the book launches anyone liked. But the sale of the 2 books, when I published these books, I said that none of the money that would come from these books would go to me personally. And so after paying the publishing costs of the book, I was able to give £20,000 to 3 charities that work with homeless people in Northern Ireland. I gave the Welcome Organisation 8,000. I gave the East Belfast Mission Hosford House 8,000. And I only included the Salvation Army in that book there, and I've given them 4. So it has been successful. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me.